Hi, um, this is sort of related to the video I made on Suella Braverman, but I'm not going to call it part two because I think it's more broad-reaching. Um, some people might say this is partisan, but what I've always tried to do is be honest about my views, and I think I've attacked the left and the right roughly equally. Not that I'm going for a sort of ratio, but basically I've always just said what I believe. And I've no vested interest, I'm not representing a political party or anything like that. So I just speak about my honest take on things. Um, and I want to talk about a taboo issue, race. Race is always taboo. Um, Maybe more taboo than anything. I think it's probably even more taboo than the gender battles between men and women and all of that. I think probably there's no issue that's potentially more divisive than race. And that's why we need to be careful how we discuss it. But I also think, by the nature of a pluralistic society, nothing should be off the table. So there are things that need to be discussed and debated and addressed. And if people feel so hypersensitive that they can't even talk about these things, then we've got a problem. Um, Now, I would reiterate some of the things I said in that video about Braverman. I do think she is definitely has definitely got question marks in her position as Home Secretary. I'm not sure she should even have the position after the ministerial breach that she was guilty of under Truss. And there are people on the right who are sort of, in a way, it's ironic. They're sort of playing the game that the woke left has long played, which is weaponizing race themselves, in the sense that they're saying, I've sort of seen this argument of late that the left can't stand minorities who don't follow their dogma, and so that's why they're being attacked. I sort of agree with that, but at the same time, ethnic minority Tories are not above criticism, and if they do happen to be criticised, it's not necessarily because they're ethnic minorities. That's a mistake that some on the right are making, to sort of assume it's only because they're an ethnic minority that they're being criticised. I mean, if a white Tory said these things, he or she would also be condemned. It's partisan politics. But I do think there is a sense. Um, I mean, Sayeeda Farsi put this in her Guardian piece. I've just read it, and she said for years she had been trying to get minorities to vote Tory. Um, the thing about Sayeeda Farsi, as I said in the previous video, I'm not entirely convinced that she has always been practical in her communication either. When the issue of Islamism has been brought up, she's been very much of the bandwagon, or we better not talk about it, because it might be bigoted. In her piece, she did say that she's discussed taboo issues at FGM and so on, so fair play to her for that. But the Tories are a big party, and they have politically correct elements as well. It's not a case that this is only a domain of the left or the Labour Party. There are politically correct Tories. There might even be some woke Tories. There probably are. Now, the thing about Braverman, and I'm going to be more broad-reaching than just the issues around her, but it is important because she's one of the most powerful people in the country. Um, she is the Home Secretary. It's a very important position. I do think that senior politicians need to be careful of the language, and it may be that she could have brought up the issue about British Pakistani men in a more diplomatic way, because she's sort of given the left this thing to throw at her, like, oh, look at Braverman vilifying all British Pakistani men. Actually, I have not heard anybody say that these grooming gangs are only at the hands of British Pakistani men. The Home Office's own report found in 2020 the most perpetrators are white, but most of the country's white, so that isn't overly surprising. And that's a nationwide picture. As Baroness Farsi in her own piece recognised, there are certain exceptions. There are certain, not exceptions, but there's certain localised situations in which there is disproportionate things going on. That's not verbatim, but excuse me. For example, that's just my phone turning on. Sorry if you can hear that. Yeah, I mean, I have long believed that you cannot address a problem without talking about it. And even if we look at the national picture and say, well, most predators are white, um, yeah, that is true. But the fact of the matter is, in towns like Rochdale and Telford, there was a disproportionate number of British Pakistani men involved in grooming young girls, predominantly white. And there were other victims too. There were Asian victims and black victims when we're looking at the nationwide situation. But the difference is with white perpetrators, and this is something the left is ignoring, with white perpetrators, there isn't that politically correct sense of, oh, we better not talk about this, you know. People are disgusted by it, and it's a terrible crime. But where race isn't a factor, it's not a factor. So, for example, if you have a white predator and white victims, that's race isn't going to be a factor in that. If you have British Pakistani perpetrators and most of the victims are white, race is a factor. No getting away from that. Especially if their motivation is because they believe working class white girls are cheap. You know, they have this racist attitude to it. What I find a bit galling about Guardianistas is a complete inconsistency on race, and I believe this points to the left's attitude to race more generally, the reactionary left, I should say. I mean, the thing is, when you get a right wing racist, you know, the left will be all over it. Um, when it's a right wing minority who's doing the racism, then they'll say that they're a disappointment, you know, or they're racist, or they point is it's a part of something because they're on the right. But when you get someone, let's say a Black Lives Matter activist who, you know, is all for transgender rights, and that person comes out with some racist sweeping statement about white people or even against Asian people and says that they're not true minorities. We haven't had that so much in the UK, but it has been a bizarre trajectory in the United States. Um, you know, does the Guardian call them out on the racism? Never. In fact, the Guardian will double down in defending them. So I find the Guardians. I keep mentioning the Guardian. This could expand to the deaf more general, but I think the Guardian's a good example. It's it's just sheer hypocrisy. You're either against all racism or you're not. So you can't say we're going to condemn racism when it's against minorities or it's right wingers doing it, or it's, you know, Tories doing it. But you know, when it's, I mean, I think it's this mentality that the left cannot be racist. But hey, we're progressive, so how can we be racist? Well, by definition, prejudice against an entire race is racism. Um, I think anyone who said that we need to treat all British Pakistani men with suspicion, that's a racist position. But saying there has been a specific problem in some towns with British Pakistani grooming gangs is not a racist position. It's an empirical fact. This is the difference, and this is what people don't understand. Um, and you know, the left also in other areas as well. The reactionary left when it comes to stop and search. You know, oh, we better not do that, but it's disproportionately targets young black men. Well, could it be that maybe in London there is a problem with young black men involved in gangs? So obviously there's going to be more stop and search. Could it be that there's some racist cops that are doing it just because they don't like black guys? Possibly, and that's wrong. And I think the police need to tackle that problem. But I also think we need to be careful that the police aren't shackled by political correctness. And, you know, calls to defund the police or cancel stop and search. Stop and search has been proven to save lives. But we can even look at this in the case of counter-terrorism. The Manchester Arena bomber, there was evidence that emerged in that subsequent investigation that, you know, opportunities to apprehend him were missed because of fear that it would be seen as racist. I believe the security guard at the arena testified that that was his concern. But the left always do this. I mean, and you know, there's a the left and Islamists have long been bedfellows. So when it comes to counterterrorism, look at the government's Prevent program. Even though that's applied to all extremism, it's applied to far right extremism as well. That hasn't stopped Muslim lobby groups from saying, "Oh, this is Islamophobic. It's vilifying Muslims. It's targeting Muslims." No, it's tackling a problem that is very real: pan-Islamist extremism. So those lobby groups, instead of constantly playing the victim, they should work with the government if they're serious about tackling the problem. The point about Prevent is it aims at all extremism. It's also tackling far right extremism, as it should. So this notion it just picks on Muslims is absurd. It's a lie. And I question anyone whose whole agenda is to push back against efforts to counter terrorism. I mean, what are they doing to solve the problem? What are they doing to stop radicalization instead of bleating about victimhood all the time? Talking about lobby groups like Five Pillars. They'll never directly condone terrorism. They're not stupid. They will constantly play the victimhood narrative. The First Minister of Scotland is doing this. Um, I don't think he's going to last very long. I hope he doesn't. But the point I'm making here is that where there are problems, they need to be looked at. Let me just play the other side of the card here. Let's say there is an issue that disproportionately is involving young white men. I say, we shouldn't shy away from that. That should be spoken about. Maybe something like football hooliganism. Probably the majority of football hooligans, in this country at least, are young white men. That has to be spoken about. And, white guys like me can't say, oh, white guys are being picked on, because it is something that is happening. It's something that's out there. So people have to be honest and not constantly think that it's a personal attack because there is a discussion of something that is going on in their community. So, any British Pakistani man who might feel vilified by this, I would say, okay, I get it. You don't want to be associated with these predators, but instead of maybe taking it personally, why don't you just recognize that there is a particular problem? Instead of said, oh, but it's not all of us. Most reasonable people know that. Um, I just abhor the way the left weaponizes race, and they love to smear people with this label. Um, and the problem with it is it's a very, very, very powerful label. It sticks, especially if you're white, it sticks. So, of course, the caveat here is actual racists do need to be called out. Of course they do. I just wish there was more consistency. And I cannot stand the hypocrisy of those who, for example, will demand that David Starkey loses his job, yet Dr. Priyamvada Gopal gets to keep hers. Yet they both made racially insensitive statements. But one is fired, the other gets to keep her job. Why? The left is staggeringly hypocritical in this. Basically, if the racist is a left wing minority, that's fine. They get a free pass. Or at most, sort of there'll be some excuse made for them, like, oh well, it was taken out of context, or they didn't really mean it, or they're just responding to right wing trolls. This happens all the time. So this is one of the biggest problems I have with the left, the way they try to weaponize race, and they really do. I'm not saying the right doesn't do it either, but I think the left does it a lot more. Um, I mean, they have always pushed identity politics. I think of a Tory campaign poster from the 80s. It's probably the Saatchi brothers, and it showed a black man in a business suit, and the slogan said, "To Labour he is black, to the Tories he is British." Now, there's a clever message behind that. In other words, it's Labour that is putting this thing on him, putting this label on him. We're not. Now, this doesn't mean that the Tories' track record is good. I think there probably are some racists in Tory ranks. But, the left is in a bit of a situation here because they know that the Tories are more diverse than they are right now. Look at the cabinet. I mean, my goodness, we have a British Asian Prime Minister, a British Asian Home Secretary, um, um, a black Briton who's foreign secretary, a white guy who's chancellor. Um, I mean, it's just the left know that they cannot just say all the Tories are racist. It's too simplistic. It's the reality is more nuanced, and I think they cannot stand the fact that there are conservatives like Braverman, like Kimi Badenoch and others who are prepared to call out wokeism. Now, this doesn't mean the minority Tories are above critique, and I don't think criticising them, it automatically means that because they're a minority. So the right should play the same game as the left by saying, "Oh, they cannot be criticised," or if they are criticised, it's just a race thing. Dan Wootton on GB News was sort of insinuating that was the case. I don't agree with that. Um, but I'll wrap this up. Look, a pluralistic, tolerant society has to be able to not marginalize people, but also be able to talk about things candidly. Um, I think, people are intelligent. Most people are reasonably intelligent. Most people don't genuinely vilify an entire race unless they're obnoxious racist bigots or they're same difference woke bigots who are pushing identity politics and speaking in narratives of white privilege and all that crap. Um, but we have to be able to talk about problems, whether it be, let's say, white football hooliganism, whether it be British Pakistani grooming gangs as part of the wider issue of grooming gangs, um, or the problem of pan-Islamist extremism. Those issues, they're taboo, but they have to be discussed. They have to be. And I'm sick and tired of these left-wing reactionaries. The second these things are raised, they say, oh, it's dog whistle politics. You can't talk about that. You can't talk about it. It's racism. It's pandering to the far right. Here's the problem. The far right, genuine white supremacists and ethno-nationalistic types, the blood and soil nationalists, the likes of Combat 18 and um, other less known groups, they will fill this vacuum. If moderate people don't talk about these things openly and candidly, they will fill the vacuum. So what I would put to the reaction to the left is, our mainstream politicians like Braverman, are they pandering to the far right or are they reclaiming the debate? Now, I think Braverman can be more diplomatic. Some of her language, talking about migrants as an invasion, for example, is unhelpful. It is unhelpful. And for someone who's a trained lawyer, she should know better. I think you can be populist without being inflammatory. I actually think they're not necessarily the same thing. I mean, populism is just listening to the people, ultimately. Populism needn't be, this sort of bombastic, Trumpian, um, inflammatory rhetoric, but it can be listening to the people. And Braverman's brief is to tackle the boats issue, part of her brief. If the Guardian Aces had their way, there would be no limits. Everyone could come in, and it's racist to say otherwise. So I just don't share their worldview. I think they're very naive, and I do not like the way they weaponize race. Let me know your thoughts.